Your hands were bleeding again. The cotton fibers had worked their way under your fingernails, into the cracks in your skin, and no matter how carefully you moved, the cuts reopened. You'd been working for 14 hours. The machine in front of you never stopped. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of metal grinding against metal that made your ears ring even in the few hours you weren't in the factory. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated your lungs and made every breath feel like swallowing sand. You were 7 years old. You'd been working here for 6 months, ever since your father sold your labor to the factory owner to pay off a debt. You hadn't seen your mother in weeks. You slept in the factory dormitory with 40 other children on straw mattresses crawling with lice. You worked 6 days a week, 16 hours a day, for wages so low your father drank most of them away before you ever saw a penny. This wasn't childhood. This was survival, and you were so tired you couldn't remember what it felt like to play. The late 1700s through the mid-1800s saw childhood transform into something unrecognizable by today's standards. Children weren't protected. They weren't given time to learn or grow or simply be young. They were economic assets, small bodies that could fit into spaces adults couldn't reach, workers who could be paid less and controlled more easily than grown men. In England, across Europe, and in the growing industrial centers of America, children as young as 5 were put to work. Factories, mines, farms, domestic service, chimney sweeping. Any job that needed doing, children did it. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development didn't exist for the poor. Rich children had tutors and leisure and relatively safe lives. Poor children had work. Endless, brutal, body-destroying work that started before dawn and didn't end until you collapsed. There were no child labor laws, no safety regulations, no mandatory education. If your family needed money, you worked. If you didn't work, you starved. It was that simple, and the work wasn't light tasks or helping around a family farm. It was industrial labor that maimed and killed thousands of children every year. Children lost fingers in machinery. They suffocated in coal mines. They fell from chimneys and broke their backs. They died from exhaustion and disease and accidents that were entirely preventable but never prevented because their lives weren't valued enough to matter. Robert Hayes was 6 when he started working in a textile mill in Manchester. His mother was a widow with 5 children. His father had died in a factory accident 2 years earlier, crushed between 2 machines when he stumbled from exhaustion. The factory paid nothing, no compensation, no support. The family lost their home within a month. Robert's mother found work as a washerwoman, but the pay was almost nothing. She couldn't feed 5 children on what she earned, so she took Robert and his 8-year-old sister Emma to the factory and sold their labor. The contract was for 7 years. The children would work and the factory would pay their wages directly to their mother. Robert and Emma had no say. They were walked into the factory on a Monday morning, shown to the machines they'd operate and put to work immediately. No training, no explanation of the dangers, just point at the machine and start. Robert's job was to crawl under the running machines and collect cotton scraps that fell through. The space was barely 2 feet high. He had to crawl on his stomach while the machines ran above him, close enough that he could feel the vibration in his bones. If he moved wrong, if he wasn't fast enough, the machinery would catch his clothes or his hair and pull him in. He'd seen it happen to other children. A boy named Peter had been caught 3 weeks before Robert started. The machine pulled him up and crushed his arm before someone hit the emergency stop. Peter screamed for 20 minutes before they got him free. His arm was mangled, hanging at an impossible angle. They carried him out and Robert never saw him again. No one talked about it. Everyone just went back to work. The hours were inhuman. Robert woke at 4 in the morning to a bell that clanged through the dormitory. You had 15 minutes to use the privy, splash water on your face, and line up for a piece of bread. Then you walked to the factory floor and worked until 8 at night. 16 hours, with 2 10-minute breaks, one for a mid-morning meal of watery porridge, one for an afternoon piece of bread and maybe some cheese if the overseers were feeling generous. You ate standing up. You ate fast. If you took too long, you were beaten. The overseers carried leather straps and weren't afraid to use them. Robert was hit on his second day for moving too slowly. The strap caught him across the shoulders and knocked him down. He learned quickly. Move fast. Never complain. Keep your eyes on your work. The factory was suffocating. Summer heat turned it into an oven. Winter cold seeped through the walls, but the machines kept running, so you kept working even when your fingers were too numb to feel what you were doing. The noise never stopped. The dust never settled. Children coughed constantly. Some coughed up blood. A girl named Mary who worked near Robert developed a horrible wet cough that never went away. She kept working because stopping meant losing wages, and losing wages meant her family didn't eat. She collapsed one afternoon, face first onto the floor. By the time they carried her out, she wasn't breathing. She was 9 years old. They had her replacement working the next day. There was no childhood left in Robert. No games, no laughter, no learning. Everything that should have defined his early years was gone, replaced by endless repetitive labor and the constant fear of injury or death. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. He didn't know numbers beyond basic counting. His entire existence was the factory. Sleep, work, sleep, work. The other children weren't friends. They were competitors for the overseer's approval, for the scraps of food, for the least dangerous positions on the factory floor. Robert watched children steal from each other. He watched them fight over a piece of bread. He watched them become hollow-eyed and mechanical, moving through their tasks like broken toys. He felt it happening to himself. The gradual erasure of everything that made him a child. He stopped crying when he got hurt because crying meant weakness, and weakness got you beat. He stopped asking when he'd see his mother because asking didn't change anything. He stopped thinking about the future because there was no future. Just the next shift and the one after that, and the endless parade of days that blurred together into a gray nightmare he couldn't escape. If you were Robert, 6 years old and trapped in a system that saw you as nothing more than a small machine, would you have kept going? Would you have found the strength to crawl under those machines every day, knowing that one mistake meant death? Or would you have given up, accepted that this was all your life would ever be? Injuries were constant and horrific. Children lost fingers regularly when they tried to clear jammed machinery that was still running. Overseers didn't want to stop production, so they'd order children to fix problems while the machines operated. Robert saw a boy lose 3 fingers trying to untangle thread from spinning gears. The fingers were just gone, torn off so fast the boy didn't even realize it for a few seconds. Then he started screaming. They wrapped his hand in a dirty rag and sent him back to the dormitory. No doctor, no proper care. The wound got infected. The boy developed a fever and died a week later. Robert was 7 when he had his first serious injury. He was crawling under a machine to collect scraps when his shirt caught on a protruding bolt. The fabric pulled tight around his chest. He panicked and tried to pull away, but the machine was pulling him backward toward the gears. He screamed. An overseer heard and hit the emergency stop just in time. The machine stopped inches from Robert's back. If it had been 5 seconds slower, he would have been pulled into the gears and crushed. They cut him free, beat him for being careless, and put him back to work the same day. Robert's hands shook for hours afterward. He couldn't stop seeing how close he'd come. But there was no time to process it. No time to recover from the fear, just back to work. But here's what made it truly evil. The factory owners knew exactly what they were doing. They knew children were dying. They knew the conditions were lethal. Factory inspectors, the few that existed, filed reports documenting the horrors. Reformers wrote pamphlets describing children worked to death. Doctors testified about the respiratory diseases caused by cotton dust, the deformities caused by repetitive motion, the stunted growth from malnutrition. None of it mattered, because child labor was profitable. Children could be paid a quarter of adult wages. They were easier to control. They didn't organize or demand better conditions. They were perfect workers from an owner's perspective, and the law protected the owners, not the children. Parents had the legal right to sell their children's labor. Contracts were enforceable. If a child ran away, they could be hunted down and returned, then punished severely. The system was designed to trap children in this cycle of exploitation, and it worked flawlessly for decades. The Industrial Revolution was built on the broken bodies of children. The wealth that flowed into England and America, the economic growth celebrated in history books, it came from 6-year-olds working 16-hour days in conditions that killed them before they reached adolescence. Think about the protections children have today. Child labor laws, mandatory education, age restrictions on work hours, safety regulations. Now imagine all of that gone. Imagine a world where a 6-year-old working 16 hours in a dangerous factory is legal and normal. Would you send your child there? Would you accept that system? Or would you see it for what it truly was, institutionalized child abuse on a massive scale? Most children who worked in factories didn't reach adulthood. The combination of overwork, malnutrition, disease, and accidents killed them. Robert lasted 4 years. By the time he was 10, his body was already failing. The constant crawling had damaged his back. He couldn't stand up straight. His lungs were scarred from breathing cotton dust for years. He coughed all the time, bringing up thick mucus streaked with black. His hands were covered in scars and missing parts of 2 fingers from an accident with a blade used to cut thread. He looked like an old man. His face was gaunt. His eyes were hollow. He moved slowly, every step clearly painful. One morning in winter, Robert woke up and couldn't breathe properly. His chest felt tight. Each breath was a struggle. He tried to get up for work, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He collapsed on the floor of the dormitory. The other children stepped around him and went to work. No one helped. No one stayed. The overseer came through an hour later, saw Robert on the floor, and called for someone to move him. They carried him to a back room where sick children were left. There was no doctor, no medicine, just a dirty mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. Robert died 2 days later. His lungs had filled with fluid, probably pneumonia complicated by years of dust inhalation. He was alone when he died. His mother was never notified. She moved to a different city months earlier and had no way of knowing what had happened to her son. The factory buried him in a mass grave with other workers who died that month. No marker, no funeral, no record beyond a brief note in the factory's ledger that his contract was terminated due to death. He was 10 years old. He'd spent nearly half his life working in that factory, and when he died, he was disposed of like broken equipment. The system didn't change. More children were brought in, more contracts were signed, the machines kept running, and society continued to function, comfortable and prosperous, because no one with power cared enough to stop it. The clothes people wore were made by dying children. The textiles they bought were produced at the cost of young lives. Everyone knew. It wasn't a secret. Factories were in cities where thousands of people saw children walking to work before dawn, saw them emerge 16 hours later barely able to stand. But acknowledging the horror would have required action. It would have required wealthy factory owners to accept lower profits. It would have required consumers to pay more for goods. It would have required admitting that the entire economic system was predicated on the exploitation and destruction of the most vulnerable members of society. So instead, people looked away. They told themselves that work was good for children, that it taught discipline and responsibility. They convinced themselves that poor children were better off working than idle. They created moral justifications for what was nothing more than mass murder for profit. Even when reforms finally came, when child labor laws were passed in the mid to late 1800s, they came too late for the millions who'd already been consumed by the system. And the reforms were weak, poorly enforced, and full of loopholes. Children still worked, just slightly fewer hours in slightly less dangerous conditions. The fundamental attitude that children were economic resources rather than human beings deserving of protection persisted. It persists today in parts of the world where child labor still exists, where children as young as 5 work in factories and fields and mines because their families are desperate and the law doesn't protect them. The Industrial Revolution didn't end child exploitation. It just moved it, hid it, made it someone else's problem in countries far enough away that consumers don't have to think about it. The same mechanisms that destroyed Robert are still operating. The same profit calculations that valued cheap labor over human life are still being made. History didn't solve the problem. It just taught it to be quieter, to hide better, to make itself invisible enough that people can ignore it without feeling guilty. And that might be the cruelest lesson of all.